In the year 1345, the two most powerful banks in Europe collapsed in the same month, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. Florentine houses so large they had branches from London to Cyprus. They had financed kings, popes, and crusades. And then King Edward III of England refused to pay back what he owed them, roughly 1.5 million gold florins between the two firms, and within weeks, both empires were dust. Florence panicked. Depositors rioted. Smaller banks fell like dominoes. Within 3 years, the Black Death would arrive and kill a third of the city. Anyone with money was wiped out, almost, because there was a third family in that same city, smaller, quieter, mostly in the wool business at the time. They survived the bank crash. They survived the plague. They survived wars, exiles, assassination plots, and 4 full regime changes. And then, over the next 100 years, they didn't just rebuild. They became the richest family in Europe, financed the Renaissance, put 4 of their own sons on the throne of St. Peter, and married into every royal house on the continent. Their name was Medici. And the question this video is going to answer is the only one that actually matters. What did they own, and how was it structured, that let them walk through a century of catastrophe while everyone richer than them was buried? Because the answer is not what most people think. It wasn't luck, it wasn't genius, it was a specific architecture of wealth. And that same architecture is being rebuilt right now by a very small number of families who plan to be rich 100 years from now. Let's get into it. To understand the Medici, you have to first understand what killed everyone around them. In the early 1300s, Florence was the financial capital of Europe. Imagine New York, London, and Singapore compressed into one walled city of 100,000 people. Its currency, the gold florin, was the dollar of its day. Its banking houses, Bardi, Peruzzi, Acciaiuoli, handled the deposits of cardinals, the war loans of kings, the trade finance of every wool shipment from England to Constantinople. And these houses had one thing in common. They were big, they were sophisticated, and they were dangerously concentrated. The Bardi had lent enormous sums to King Edward III of England to finance his war against France, the war we now call the 100 Years' War. The Peruzzi had done the same. When Edward looked at his books in 1345 and realized he could simply refuse to pay, he refused. There was no international court, no collateral he couldn't seize, no one to enforce the debt, so the loans evaporated. And here is the part that matters for our story. It wasn't the loss itself that killed the Bardi and Peruzzi. Rich families lose money all the time. What killed them was that the loss was correlated. Every part of their business was downstream of the same king. When Edward defaulted, the bank's capital was gone. The depositors panicked. The panic triggered a run. The run forced the sale of the wool inventory at fire sale prices, and the wool losses bankrupted the trading arm. One domino, the whole house. Then, in 1346 and 1347, hailstorms destroyed the Tuscan harvest twice in a row. Famine. In 1348, the Black Death arrived from Genoa and killed roughly half the population of Florence in 18 months. Banks that had survived the Edward default could not survive plague-emptied workshops and dead debtors. Now, where were the Medici during all of this? They were not yet a major bank. In the 1340s, they were a mid-tier wool family, members of the Arte della Lana, the Wool Guild, which at its peak employed 30,000 workers directly and supported indirectly a third of the city's population. The Medici had a workshop. They had some land outside the walls. They had cousins in Rome doing small-scale money changing on the side. They were, by the standards of 1340, boring, and boring saved them. While the Bardi were lending six-figure sums to a foreign king, the Medici were collecting rent on Tuscan farmland and selling cloth to French merchants. When the bank crash came, they had no exposure to Edward. When the plague came, the land was still there. The soil doesn't catch the plague. When the famine came, they owned the food. This is the first principle, and we'll come back to it. Uncorrelated assets survive correlated shocks, but it's not the whole story, because plenty of small wool families survived 1348, and none of them became the Medici. What happened next is what separates surviving from compounding. Fast forward 50 years. Florence has rebuilt. The Black Death is now a memory the elderly tell the young. A new generation of Medici has come of age, and one of them is named Giovanni de' Medici. Giovanni is not flashy. Contemporary descriptions call him cautious, soft-spoken, almost dull. He is the kind of man who, in a room full of merchant princes, you would not notice. This will turn out to matter. In 1393, Giovanni does something small. He buys out the Roman branch of a bank owned by his cousin. Just the Roman branch, not a kingdom-spanning empire. One office in one city with one main client. But that one client is the Roman Curia, the Pope. In 1397, 4 years later, he formally moves the headquarters to Florence and registers what we now call the Medici Bank. That date, 1397, is the official founding. But the real founding was 1393, when a quiet wool family bought their way into the cash flows of the Catholic Church. And here is why this matters. Edward III could default. Philip of France could default. Any king could default. But the Pope's revenue came from tithes, indulgences, and church taxes paid by every Christian household in Europe. It was the most diversified revenue stream in the medieval world. Millions of payers, recurring, inflation-resistant, and politically protected by the threat of excommunication. Giovanni had found the one client whose income was more stable than any king's, and he was about to build an entire architecture around that client, an architecture so well designed that it would still be studied 600 years later by hedge funds and family offices who want to do the exact same thing. Let's look at the four pieces. The first piece of the Medici machine was the branch system. By the year 1455, the Medici Bank had branches in Florence, Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan, Pisa, Geneva, Lyon, Bruges, and London. 10 cities, 5 countries, 3 currencies. A network that, in scope, rivaled the old Knights Templar banking system that had been crushed by the French crown a century earlier. But here is the thing nobody mentions about the Medici network. Each branch was not a department of the parent bank. Each branch was a separate legal partnership with local junior partners who held real equity, registered under local law in each city. This sounds like an accounting detail. It is not. It is the most important architectural decision the family ever made. Here is what it bought them. First, limited liability. If the London branch went bankrupt because of a bad loan to an English wool merchant, the loss stopped at the London partnership. The Florence headquarters could not be sued for it. The other 9 branches were untouched. In modern terms, they had invented something close to the LLC, 200 years before Dutch lawyers would formalize it. Second, political camouflage. A single bank with 10 foreign offices looks to any king or duke like a foreign power. Something to tax, regulate, or seize. But 10 separate local partnerships, each registered under local law, each with local Florentine junior partners, that looks like 10 ordinary local businesses. Less threatening. harder to grab. Third, local expertise with skin in the game. The branch manager in Bruges was a junior partner with a real ownership stake. He didn't make decisions to please head office. He made decisions to protect his own capital. This sounds obvious. It is not obvious. Most large medieval enterprises ran on hired managers who had no ownership and no incentive. And most of them got robbed by their own employees within a generation. Fourth, and this is the elegant one, any branch could be declared independent by simply rearranging the books. If political pressure built up against the Medici in, say, Lyon, they could repaper the partnership, sell the headquarters stake to a local figurehead, and walk away. The branch survives. The brand survives. The capital is preserved. The Bardi and Peruzzi had nothing like this. They were unitary firms with foreign offices. One king's default reached every account on every desk in every city. The Medici structure meant that no single shock, no single default, no single war, no single seizure could touch more than one node. This is the first asset class in the Medici portfolio, legal architecture as a firewall. And it's the first thing modern dynastic families rebuild today, only now they call it a multi-jurisdictional holding structure. The second piece is older than banking and will outlive banking. Land. While the Medici were building their bank, they were buying Tuscan farmland with both hands. Estates in the Mugello, the family's ancestral region, vineyards, olive groves, mills, villas with productive farmland attached. By the mid-1400s, the family owned a portfolio of agricultural estates that produced wine, oil, grain, and rent in cash and in kind. Here is what land does that a bank cannot do. Land does not run. When a depositor panics and pulls his deposit, the bank can collapse in a week. We have seen this happen for 900 years, and we will see it next year too. But a vineyard does not have depositors. The grapes ripen on their own schedule, regardless of what the credit markets are doing in Bruges. Land cannot be defaulted on. A king can refuse to pay back a loan. He cannot refuse to let the wheat grow. The Medici understood that real assets, assets you can walk on, harvest, mill, and sell, have a property no financial asset has. Their value does not depend on someone else's promise. Land is hard to seize without political cost. A foreign king can confiscate the assets of a foreign bank with a stroke of a pen. Edward III did exactly that. But seizing land owned by a prominent local family in your own jurisdiction creates a fight with that family, with their tenants, with their neighbors, and with the church if the land has chapels on it. It is doable, but expensive, and most rulers, most of the time, decide not to bother. And here is the part that turns land from defensive into offensive. Land in the Mugello did not just produce rent, it produced political control. The peasants who farmed Medici land voted in Florentine elections, fought in Florentine militias, and when the Medici needed it, marched on the city. By the 1430s, when Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's son, took de facto power in Florence, his power was not just based on bank deposits. It was based on the fact that he could mobilize thousands of armed tenants whose families ate Medici grain. Bardi and Peruzzi had no equivalent. They had warehouses full of trade goods, ledgers full of receivables, and offices full of clerks, none of which can stand in a square holding a sword. Modern parallel, and we'll go deeper on this in a few minutes. But pay attention to what the wealthiest family offices in 2026 are buying. Not stocks, not bonds, farmland, timberland, water rights. The Bill Gates Trust is now the largest private farmland owner in the United States. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has a real estate allocation. The Saudi PIF has been buying agricultural land across Africa and Eastern Europe for 15 years. They are doing in 2026 exactly what Giovanni de' Medici was doing in 1410. And for the same reason, banks fail. Currencies devalue. Land grows wheat. The third piece of the portfolio is the one most people forget because it is unsexy. The Medici never stopped manufacturing. While the bank was lending to popes and dukes, the family was also running wool workshops and silk workshops in Florence. They owned looms. They owned dyeing operations. They employed weavers, fullers, dyers, and spinners. They sold finished cloth to merchants from Spain to Constantinople. Why? They were already the bankers to the Pope. They were already collecting rent on half of Tuscany. Why bother with the dirty, fiddly, low-margin business of making cloth? 3 reasons. Reason 1, cash flow timing. Banking income was lumpy and dependent on the political weather. A war could freeze receivables for years. Land income was seasonal. It came in at harvest. But textile production produced weekly cash flow. Cloth shipped, cloth sold, cash in. The workshops paid the wage bill, paid the household expenses, paid the staff, and kept the lights on, while the bank was waiting on a king and the farms were waiting on a harvest. 3 different cash flow rhythms, smoothing each other out. Reason 2, vertical integration. The Medici Bank financed wool merchants. The Medici workshops bought wool from those same merchants. The Medici land grew the food that fed the workshop workers. Each piece reinforced the other. A weaver who got fired from a Medici workshop was a weaver whose family was eating Medici bread on Medici land, and who, when called, would still vote Medici in the next election. Reason 3, information. A merchant family that only owns a bank sees the world through balance sheets. A merchant family that also runs workshops sees demand shift in real time. They knew, before their banking competitors did, when Spanish wool prices were about to spike, when Flemish demand for silk was softening, when the English embargo was hurting their counterparties. The factory floor was an intelligence network. This is the third asset, industry, as both a hedge and a censor. The wool business that the family had started with, back in the 1200s, was never abandoned even after they became the richest bankers in Europe. They kept their hands in the trade, because the trade was the source of the information that made the banks smart. There is a modern version of this, and it is not subtle. The Koch family did not stop refining oil when they got into finance. The Walton family did not stop running stores when they got into real estate. The Mars family, yes, the candy bar family, owns banks, pet hospitals, and food brands. They will not sell the candy. The candy is the censor. The fourth piece is the strangest one, and it's the one that turns a wealthy family into a dynasty. The Medici spent enormous sums on things that did not produce a financial return. They funded the building of churches. They paid for the dome of the Florence Cathedral. That dome, the one Brunelleschi built, the one in every photograph of Florence, was Medici financed. They paid for hospitals, orphanages, and convents. They commissioned art from Donatello, Botticelli, Fra Angelico, and later Michelangelo and Leonardo. This is usually told as a story about beauty and patronage. The Medici loved art. They cared about the city. They were enlightened. That is half the story. The other half is colder. Every florin spent on a chapel was a florin that bought legitimacy. Every artist on retainer was an employee whose public success reflected on the patron. Every hospital with a Medici crest on the door was a piece of public infrastructure that, if any future regime tried to seize, would trigger riots from the people who used it. Here is what cultural capital does that financial capital cannot. It cannot be confiscated. The Dome of Florence cannot be moved to a vault in Geneva, but it can be associated with a family so thoroughly that any attack on the family looks like an attack on the city itself. This is soft armor. It does not stop a sword. It makes the sword socially expensive to swing. In 1494, when a populist preacher named Savonarola briefly drove the Medici out of Florence, the family went into exile. But they didn't disappear. Their land was still there. Their bank branches in other cities still operated. Their cultural footprint was still embedded in every public square. 18 years later, in 1512, they walked back into Florence and resumed power. Try doing that as a family that spent its money only on yachts. Then the dynastic conversion. The Medici, over time, parlayed their wealth into 4 popes: Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo XI. 2 queens of France, Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, which they ruled from 1569 to 1737. Wealth converted to titles. Titles, once granted, are sticky in ways that wealth is not. A bank can fail in a week. A noble title takes a revolution to remove. By the time the original Medici Bank was finally wound down in 1494, the family no longer needed it. They had already converted the underlying capital into political and dynastic position that would survive for another 2.5 centuries. This is the 4th asset: legitimacy and lineage as the final layer of armor. Most fortunes don't reach this stage because their owners never realized that money is not the goal. Position is the goal. Money is just the vehicle. So let's bring this forward 600 years. If you watch what the largest family offices and sovereign funds are doing in 2026, the actual portfolio choices, not the press releases, you are watching the Medici architecture being rebuilt in modern materials. Layer 1, the legal firewall. The branch network has become the multi-jurisdictional holding structure. A Singapore family office will hold its operating businesses in a Cayman entity, its real estate in a Luxembourg structure, its venture portfolio in Delaware, and its private equity in a Jersey trust. Each entity is legally separate. A regulatory shock in one jurisdiction, a wealth tax, a sanctions regime, an asset freeze does not propagate to the others. The branch system, with better lawyers. Layer 2, the land. Farmland, timberland, and water rights have been the quietest accumulation story of the last 20 years. In the United States, the top 100 private landowners now hold roughly 42 million acres, an area larger than Florida. In Eastern Europe, sovereign and family money has been buying agricultural land since the 2008 crisis. The reasoning is identical to Giovanni de Bicci's. When fiat assets get repriced by inflation, by default, by sanction, productive land does not get repriced to zero. It still grows wheat. Layer 3, the workshops. The modern Medici don't just hold passive equity, they hold operating businesses in industries they understand, with cash flow they control. Berkshire Hathaway is not a hedge fund. It is a holding company that owns insurance, railroads, energy, and consumer goods. Inditex, the Zara parent, is held by a family that did not stop running stores once it became wealthy. The Mars family, the Cargill family, the Koch family, none of them sold the operating business when it would have been rational to convert to a portfolio of stocks. The operating business is the sensor and the cash machine. Selling it would blind them. Layer 4, the soft armor. Modern philanthropy, university chairs, museum wings, and political contributions are the 2026 version of the Brunelleschi Dome. They are expensive, they do not produce financial return, and they make the family socially and politically expensive to attack. When you read a story about a billionaire donating a hospital wing, you are reading a story about an asset purchase. The asset being purchased is legitimacy. The pattern is identical. Legal firewall, real assets, operating cash flow, soft armor. 4 layers, each handling a different kind of risk, none of them correlated to the others. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable. If you are someone who thinks of wealth as a single number on a brokerage statement. The Bardi and Peruzzi had a single number too. They were richer, on paper, than the Medici were in 1340. They were celebrated. They were invited to royal courts. Their statements showed enormous wealth. And then one king said no, and 10 years later, there was no Bardi and no Peruzzi. The number on the statement was a lie. The number was correlated to a single counterparty, and when that counterparty defaulted, the number went to 0. The Medici understood, before almost anyone else in the medieval world, that net worth is not a number, it is a structure. 2 families with the same total assets can have wildly different odds of surviving the next century, depending on how those assets are arranged. A pile of gold in one room is fragile. The same pile, divided into 4 uncorrelated layers across multiple jurisdictions, is something close to indestructible. Most people, when they accumulate wealth, optimize for the number. The Medici optimized for the structure. 600 years later, that decision is still paying interest. Now here is where most channels would stop, with a tidy lesson about how the rich stay rich. But I want to push one layer further, because the Medici principle scales down. You do not need 10 branches in 10 cities to apply this. You need to ask, honestly, the same 4 questions Giovanni de' Medici was asking in 1393. Question 1. What is my single point of failure? For the Bardi, it was Edward III. For most people today, it is one job, in one company, in one country, paid in one currency, with one bank holding the savings. If any one of those goes wrong, everything else falls. That is a Bardi structure. Identifying it is the first step to dismantling it. Question 2. What fraction of my assets is real, and what fraction is a promise? A bank deposit is a promise. A bond is a promise. A pension is a promise. An employer match is a promise. None of these are bad, but a portfolio that is 100% promises is a portfolio betting that no major counterparty in your life ever defaults. The Medici kept land. The modern equivalent is some allocation, even small, to real assets you actually own and could, in principle, walk to. Question 3. Do I have multiple cash flow rhythms? A salary is monthly. A side business produces weekly cash. A dividend portfolio produces quarterly cash. A piece of rental property produces monthly cash, but with a different correlation than the salary. Each rhythm smooths the others. A household that depends on one rhythm is a Bardi Peruzzi. A household with 3 is a Medici in miniature. Question 4. What is my soft armor? What relationships, reputations, skills, and social capital exist that would survive even if my financial assets were halved overnight? This is the most uncomfortable question, because it cannot be measured on a spreadsheet, but it is the layer that historically decides whether a family rebuilds after a shock or vanishes. These are the 4 Medici questions. They scale from a billionaire's family office down to a household budget. The architecture is the same. The materials change. I'll leave you with one image. In 1494, the original Medici Bank was finally dissolved. The flagship business that Giovanni de' Medici had built a century earlier, gone. By the rules of any normal business history, this is the death of the Medici. It wasn't. The bank died, and the family kept compounding for another 250 years, because the bank was never the point. The bank was one of 4 assets, and when it failed, the other 3 carried the weight: land, industry, position. The family had built a structure that did not depend on the survival of any single piece. Most fortunes are a single piece. Most fortunes die when that piece dies, and the family scatters within 2 generations. The Medici understood, 600 years ago, that the goal is not to build a fortune. The goal is to build a structure that makes the fortune unnecessary. Because by the time the fortune is at risk, 3 other layers are already holding up the house. When kings default, the smart money is not the money in the king's vault. It's the money in the vineyard, the workshop, the chapel, and the title. That's the Medici lesson, and it's the only one that has ever mattered.